I'm Peter Jones. Sorry about the mix-up there. Technical issues getting connected. So I'm going to give you an update about what's going on with the Lustre Working Group and the Lustre community releases. So first of all, Lustre Working Group, hopefully you've all heard of it by now, but it's been around for over a decade, serving as a forum where the different organizations involved in activities around the Lustre community releases, for them all to coordinate those activities and swap information and plan, etc. So the main thing that I'm going to focus on, at least up front on this talk, is the results of the OpenSFS survey from a couple of months ago. So we've been running that again for over a decade, and we use that to sort of inform our decision making around, how to prioritize testing or, changes around the releases. So this graphic you'll see just above my head here is showing the number of respondents on that survey over the years. And, I'm glad to say that we saw a bit of an uptick in the number of respondents this year compared to recent years. We've been sort of a bit lower numbers. So still, they were statistically significant, but it's good to see a bit more engagement in the survey. As I always promote this, there's no spam. It only takes a few minutes to complete. So, thank you if you have already participated, and, please, if you haven't historically, encourage you to do so when we do the same thing next year. So looking into the results, so this sort of, I think, illustrates why this survey is useful. I mean, in my day job, overseeing the sort of, working with customers direct with Whamcloud division, and also sort of the DDN customers with the Exascaler, I get to hear a lot of what those groups of sites, what their views are, or what they need. But as we can see from the survey, over half the respondents don't have any formal arrangements in place to get support, and so they're relying on either their own in-house knowledge or the sort of Lustre mailing list to get any guidance. So and then of course there are people who work with other vendors as well who also participate in the survey. So it does give us all collectively a good cross-section across the whole community about where people are at and what their views are. Looking at primary usage, so we've had this for a number of years now, and we've sort of iterated till I think we've captured the sort of, at least for the people who are on the mailing list and sort of respond to the survey, the sort of main categories that people identify with. Now, the one that really jumps out, and of course, there's a wide variety of usage, but the one that has started fairly strong and is now, the dominant one, or the most common one, is AI machine learning. And what I think is going on here is this is indicative of people are doing AI machine learning type workloads across all of these other sectors, or many of those. And so, people are selecting multiple options for this answer here, and that's why we see that one to be so, ahead of the others. Lustre versions. So this is always one that I am particularly interested in. And so again, typically I'm showing here the last 3 years, so back to 2020, with the green on the right being the most recent data. So the usual pattern we see here is that for the older releases, gradually you see a drop over time as people either upgrade or take older systems out of service, and we see strong coalescence around the two. Around any LTS branches. So that being, 210 was our former one, and that had it was a very popular release, and then 212 is the current one. So we see a little bit of a different pattern here with 214. So last year when the survey came out, I think 214 actually released during the time the survey came out. So it was very, very fresh, and, understandably didn't have a high number of people using that in production at that time. But since then, it's actually had fairly strong adoption, and to the point where you can see it's actually ahead of Lustre 210 in terms of the percentage of respondents who have production deployments of it. So I was pretty surprised at this. I knew there would be usually we see our most current release, even if it's not an LTS, does have fairly, it's significant numbers of people wanting to use the latest kernels or whatever. But I think this is, to see it overhaul 2.10 was a bit surprising to me. And I think this is indicative of the main driver there, rather than the features. I think this is to do with people looking to have more kernel support for the storage servers. So more on that a bit later, I think. Well, here. Well, so looking at, this is a question around, we've announced at Supercomputing that the upcoming 2.15 release would be our next LTS release, and that will have support for, RHEL AX or derivative storage servers. And so we were asking people how quickly they intended to move to one of those releases after it became GA. And so the blue box here, where I've classified that as immediate, was more like, within the first few months that people plan to fairly quickly move to a release. And so there's a fairly significant number of people who are in that category. And I suspect that, a number of people who on the survey were currently using 2.14 are using that as a stopgap until 2.15 is available. And then we see, there is a number, and not surprisingly again, of people who were, what I've classified as remain, and the purple near the top, that's people who were, planning to remain as long as possible on a 2.12 release. Obviously if things, there are no rush, things are working well for them, there's no real driver to have to move. And then broadly, most common option was the undecided, or the, wait and see what the initial early feedback was. So, so yes, my reading of this is that I would expect we'll see some healthy uptake in 2.15, of course, not to the point where it's the most dominant one, but in the next year's survey. And that, hopefully we'll start hearing at, conferences like this, LAD that's announced for September in Paris. And then this LUG next year, we'll hear some experiences from people who are in those, early adopter sort of sites. And, hopefully that will have had some feedback there that's sort of encouraged, others to look at moving forward. So feature usage. So this one I will stress here, most of the slides I have used percentages to show the data so you can do comparison purposes. I did initially look at doing that, but then I felt the data was a bit misleading because many people skipped this question of the overall respondents. So it was a smaller sample. And so I did raw numbers here. So you can see, for example, it was 25 sites said they plan to use PCC within the coming year, whereas rather than 25% of the overall respondents. So, a fairly significant number. And, all of these are sort of features that were either in 2.13, 2.14, or 2.15. So, anything that's post the current 2.12 LTS. And so it's just sort of, seeing that there is interest in all of those to some degree. And, again, it will be interesting to sort of hear some production experiences from sites as people are starting to use those. Looking at the Linux distributions, so we see here as pretty standard that we, as the main, the primary kernel we use in our testing and we promote is that Red Hat or Red Hat derivatives. And so as most sites are using 2.12, the primary kernel there is, Red Hat 7. So nearly all sites, 90% of sites who responded said they were using at least, one in production of a RHEL 7 derivative or RHEL 7 itself. But we do see, different to last year, some, 20%, over 20% here are using the RHEL 8 or derivatives for their servers. So again, that's probably that group we were seeing early on with the versions who are using Lustre 2.14 for the most part. So going on to clients, similar picture. We see the majority, the most common option is to use Rel 7 or derivative, and but we do see much stronger usage of some people having a Rel 8 or a Rel 8 derivative in production on their clients. Not quite 50%, but sort of mid 40s. That's fairly significant numbers. And again, this is very much what we've always seen over the years, as with a new major version of Red Hat, that we see, or we see that people move first with the clients, and then the servers like come behind afterwards. So yeah, so overall, to recap here, the analysis, as I already mentioned, that we're expecting to see strong adoption of 2.15 in next year's survey, that means hopefully we'll see those newer features get some exposure. And then there were a couple of questions that we asked that were like not of a quantitative nature. So they were more free text for people to provide feedback. So we asked about if people had suggestions on how to improve the LWG or the work we do. And so the majority of people skipped that question, or the answers weren't, we did look over the answers on the last LWG call, but there wasn't really anything too actionable, like just maybe the only things are maybe a couple of comments about how they wish that we had switched the LTS branch more quickly, which definitely I'm sure others share that view, but I know from the surveys we were doing previously around that matter, there's people who think the exact opposite. So I know, but there was a bit more engagement around the question about Lustre improvements. So sort of went over that, and again we did look at that as a group as well. And really there I was trying to pick out things where multiple people were giving the same feedback. It's a fairly large sample, and so there didn't seem to be, there weren't clear features which had, in the past when we've done this, maybe there's been things that maybe 10 or plus people are requesting the same thing, and then you think, oh yes, we have a very clear feature gap here. There were a number of people who mentioned stability, and without really elaborating specifically, what the if there was particular stability concerns, or just it was like a generalized stability. And so, if people do have specifics about that, I'd be really interested to hear if there are things that people are finding and not, are problematic. But there was a comment basically to the effect of that nowadays Lustre has a pretty mature feature set, and so really they weren't so interested in looking at other new things, but more just continuing to sort of get things working better together, and to sort of keep us where we are and improve. So maybe that's the intention there. I guess that would make sense. There were also a few questions from people using Lustre on ZFS about for the LTS branches, that they would prefer us to keep more up with the ZFS versions. So with that, I mean, obviously, as we move to 2.15, we have jumped up on master to a more current ZFS version. It had always been our intention to sort of move to newer ZFS versions. I mean, we kept the LTS branches so they could be built with any version of ZFS, so people have that flexibility, but we just hadn't made it the default because we just hadn't had the feedback from the customers we work with that was, people were running those in production successfully. So we'd always sort of erred on the side of conservatism. So it's just, if people are in that situation in the future, like, please share those views or speak up, and, we don't know what we don't know. So it just, we could have maybe done something different if we had been aware that this was an issue. And then there was a couple of people who commented that, while generally the the operational feature set was good. Some of the, the processes or admin tools around sort of important changes, when you're adding or removing, storage from your cluster, like those things were not as slick as, and some other computing technologies that were like, that was pretty clunky. So that's definitely something that we could look at how we can do that better. And then there were a number of comments about, either expanding the sort of distros we support, or about, things to do with the upstream Linux kernel, eliminating kernel patches and such like that would help sort of from an admin point of view as well. So getting on to the specifics about the releases. So 2.12 is still, for a while now we've not been putting out releases super frequently. The main trigger is when we have new distros we're adding the support for. So we had a release come out late last year. 2.12.8 was the last one, and then we would expect to do a 2.12.9 soon, and I'm anticipating that, seeing as we had a Red Hat 8.6 beta a while back, that we should see a GA version fairly soon, and then so we'll do a 2.12.9 to add support for RHEL 8.6 clients. And moving on to 2.15. So of course, in light of this being announced to be an LTS release, there's a lot of interest about when this will be available. We've been having a lot of testing that's been going on for some months with the final stage. We're definitely, I'd hoped in this talk to be able to, this would already be GA and to talk about that. Unfortunately, it's not quite there. We're still, we have completed all the run through of all the tests. There are a couple of like important edge case blockers that we're still finalizing fixes for. But so keep your eyes peeled on the mailing list. We'll obviously announce when it's ready. I think hopefully in the next days we'll have an RC4, which will should be the GA version. But yes, so very close. And certainly I think if you're looking to test on a test system, what's there now is going to be very close to the finished article. I think most of the issues that are there are not going to be, the sort of thing you would find with if you're testing on a test cluster or something, if you want to put things through their paces. And then I will clarify as well that, we have created the B215 branch, and that's where we'll issue the 2.15 maintenance releases when they come out, and we'll probably have a 2.15 one fairly shortly after the actual GA, because our usual practice is that when new distros come out, that we after code freeze, we don't change the test matrix. Otherwise, we found we can always, we'll never get a release out. So our intention will still be to move forward with this, RHEL 8 servers, even if RHEL 8.6 comes out, any day. We would still try and close the release on the initial 8.5 and then issue an update to move to 8.6, rather than, reset all the testing again and delay the initial release. And if I recall, I think we had a similar scenario around 2.12 as well. It was the last time we went into this sort of dynamic. Okay. Oh, and just to say that, and we have started, landings are we're doing the pre-landing testing for, 2.16 landings already to start getting underway. So, we are already in the final stages of 2.15. So contribution statistics. These two pie charts show our data. So I'm sorry, these are a bit of an eye chart. The Microsoft tools take over and arrange things, and it's very hard to get things to actually be legible. This was the least bad way I could make it, with fiddling around with it for a while. But this basically is data from taken from Git, and so Dustin Leatherman from Oak Ridge has a script which pulls all this data out, and so thanks Dustin for that. And the one on this side, sorry, the mirror image is confusing, is the reviews, and the one on the other side is lines of code actually contributed. So, mostly this is usual suspects we're seeing appearing here. I will call out some things that are a little bit different. Lanaro, I don't know if that's an organization that would be familiar name to most, but it's a development organization that supports activities around in the ARM ecosystem, and that is they have been engaging with the LWG and doing work to try and improve the support for ARM in Lustre, and so they have had some changes to tests and such like to make things improve the support for ARM. And there's also a couple of names which, if you can read them, might be surprising. EMC appears there, and Seagate, and these are not organizations that are active nowadays within the Lustre space, so it might be surprising, but these are actually just, this isn't a mistake, this is actually just the way the script works. There was an original patch that never got to the stage where it's landed, maybe from some years back, and then basically somebody else has picked up that work and driven it to completion, and the original author is the one who gets the credit in these graphs when things are landed for the release. And so this is the data as well up to RC3. So the final data will be very slightly different, but this is enough of a flavor, I would say. Okay, this is the latest roadmap from lustre.org. We will refresh this as soon as 2.15 is finalized to show the time that 2.15 came out, and probably move the timescale across so that we sort of see more 2.16 and 2.17 releases. Andreas, as you got a little, almost had the presentation from my lateness, but he will be talking later about the sort of things you should expect in those releases. And just so, recap that we're just in the final stages on 2.15. We'll have a couple of maintenance releases coming out in the near future to provide RHEL 8.6 support, and also other distros, like we probably will switch our Ubuntu support to Ubuntu 22.04. Now that's out. It was still not out when we went into code freeze and started having release candidates. And finally, here's the link for the Lustre working group. If anyone's interested to either join, we have bi-weekly meetings, every other week meetings, but also if you just want to sort of keep an eye on the minutes, or just join the mailing list to input if you have got some topic of interest does come up. So that's everything from me. Are there any questions anyone has?
Thanks, Peter. Stefan did ask a question in the chat, which was when 2.15 will be released, and you answered that. So thank you.
Okay.
There was also a comment by him saying that they would start moving their clients to 2.15 first when it's released.
Very good.
Anyone else with a question, you can either post in the on-air platform, or if you raise your hand, our Zoom moderator will unmute you and you can speak. Oh, okay. I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment from James, but he says no IPv6 in the roadmap.
I mean, is that James Simmons?
Correct.
Okay. I mean, we talk about the roadmap at the LWG meetings that he joined.
Well, he might be prompting you to answer that in public.
Oh, I see. So basically, we had initially had that down as a tentative feature for 2.15, but and there has been quite a lot of work has gone into sort of foundational work has gone into 2.15, but like the full body of work is not was not ready in time for the 2.15 feature freeze. So definitely that would be something we'd be looking at as we refresh the roadmap is to say, is that, when we finalize 2.15, we can say, well, look, this is going to be the code line for the cutoff date for a 2.16 features, and does it look balance of probabilities likely it'll be ready in that time? And generally, our usual approach is to try and be a little conservative, and then to sort of, with what we estimate, so that we don't have this situation where people are perhaps planning or expecting something and then it's not ready. So I think, now I think we do have a better sense of the full amount of the work that's needed to provide IPv6 support. And so then it's just I think we'll be able to answer that question more accurately as we now refresh the roadmap as to whether that's viable for 2.16 or whether it's actually more likely to be in 2.17.
Thanks, Peter. We have another question from Alex. He says, what Mellanox OFED versions will be, supported / tested in 2.15?
So, I mean, supported should be really a question for NVIDIA. We sort of, in terms of tested, it really depends on, we test, that's not the focus of our testing. So we will test whatever is the latest available that works on all our test systems we're using. So the testing that happens is, of course, across organizations, and they would all have different hardware they're using and different versions. So I think it's a hard question to answer precisely and exhaustively. I would say supported, I think we would expect, we would not be saying you can't use certain versions. That would be coming from NVIDIA if there's some, requirement around certain hardware or versions. But so I think it's just a question for us usually of finding a combination of what's the version of MoFed that's going to work with the kernels we're testing with, right? And so usually you need to move to the latest to get the support. If Red Hat 86 comes out, you need to get a new version of MoFed that's, supports that, right? No, that's not a very good answer.
That's thanks. So if I summarize it, you test with the latest MoFed related to the kernel which you're testing.
Yeah, it's driven by the kernel probably, and then or the hardware we're using for various types of testing. So yeah, it isn't something that's we are testing in different networking technologies, but also test with OPA or Ethernet at various times in the testing. And like I say, there's generally organizations would be testing ahead of the release on whatever combination of whatever equipment they care about or plan to use the release on, right? So we've had an awful lot of testing with 2.15 knowing it's going to be an LTS release. So that's one of the reasons it's taking it longer to get out, but it does mean that the end result is better for it.